The wind moved low through the old boughs of England, whispering in the hedgerows as though remembering something half buried. A name, a crown, a debt unpaid. It was not yet a war. Not yet. It was a murmur in stone corridors, a flicker in the eye of a weary king. It was the slow unraveling of order, subtle as moss eating mortar from the walls of a once mighty realm. And like all great collapses in history, it began not with a clash of swords, but with silence, the kind that grows between one generation and the next. England in the mid-15th century was not the roaring lion of her future, nor the fractured isle of her past. She was something in between, aching, uncertain, and crowned by a king more ghost than monarch. Henry VI, child of Lancaster, heir to a burning legacy and a broken mind. His crown sat upon his brow like a weight he could not feel, and behind his soft-spoken prayers lay a kingdom unguarded. The throne, though still gilded, had grown hollow. Whispers curled through the halls of Westminster and the steepled spires of Canterbury. Nobles bartered loyalties like coin. The legacy of Agincourt, the blood-soaked glory of Henry V, had faded to memory, and the sunlit fields of France, once England's prize, now slipped like sand through royal fingers. Normandy had been lost, Anjou abandoned. England's pride shriveled, even as taxes rose and hope fell. Beneath it all, something stirred. Ancient rivalries long thought buried, ambitions sheathed in velvet smiles, and the seeds of an old quarrel, sown generations before, began to bloom anew. Two roses, white and red. Two bloodlines, alike in ancestry, but divided in destiny. The House of York, proud and piercing as winter frost, claimed descent through the elder branch of Edward III, and the House of Lancaster, bold and blazing with royal fire, held the crown by right of conquest and inheritance. They were cousins in blood, but strangers in intent, and between them stood a king whose gentleness left a vacuum, whose absence invited the wolves to the fold. There is always a silence before the storm, and in that silence, prophecies walk. So it was that England began to dream uneasy dreams, of banners torn, of lords slain by their kin, of a country devouring itself for a crown. And in the candle-lit chambers of castles across the land, men sharpen not only blades, but names. For every war begins first with who has the right to rule. York, Lancaster, white rose, red. The colors meant little at first, tokens, devices, but soon they would be etched into armor, into tombstones, into memory. It was not merely a war of succession. It was a war of soul, of what England was and what she would become. And on the edge of this reckoning stood Richard, Duke of York, a man of iron, vision, and grievance. A claimant to the throne not by whim, but by the marrow of his blood. His eyes looked upon the weak hands of Henry VI and saw a crown without spine. Behind him, a league of noblemen, discontent, proud, and hungry. The call had begun. Not yet a trumpet on a battlefield, but a whisper gathering breath. In tapestries and in fields, in courtly sleights and failed parliaments, the War of the Roses had begun its slow and sacred dance. The dance of inheritance and extinction. Soon there would be battles. St. Albans, Towton, Bosworth. Soon there would be betrayals, murders in tower chambers, and young kings with their fate sealed behind stone walls. But for now, it was only the air, trembling with something unspoken. The roses had not yet been plucked, but the garden would not remain untouched. So sleep now, at the edge of memory. For we are about to walk through centuries folded into decades, where legend wears the clothes of history and every crown is paid for in blood. Let us begin. Before the clash of steel, before the banners unfurled in blood-dimmed fields, there was a name, and behind every name, a line as fragile and tangled as the roots of an old tree. To understand the War of the Roses, we must drift backward through mist and parchment to the great branching line of Edward III, King of England, who reigned with fierce majesty in the 14th century. He was a lion in his time, his reign gilded with chivalric glory and unshakable dominion. Yet like all kings who sow too widely, Edward left behind a legacy destined to choke itself. 5 sons bore the weight of his line, 5 branches sprouting from one trunk, each bearing its own ambitions, grievances, and destiny. But only 2 would shape the civil tempest to come: Lionel of Antwerp, his second son, and John of Gaunt, the third. Lionel's line was older, but through a daughter. A noble bloodline, yes, but one that passed through female veins. And in those days, blood remembered gender. His descendant was the House of York, proud, pious, and deeply wronged. Their claim, though wrapped in legitimacy, was denied by circumstance, by politics, by fate itself. John of Gaunt, however, wielded both the sword and the shadow. He was the architect of the House of Lancaster, a line cloaked in royal favor, battle-tested, and forged in the fires of survival. From him sprang Henry IV, a usurper who seized the crown from Richard II, his cousin, and began the Lancastrian rule with the clang of treason masked as necessity. It was a wound that never fully healed. Henry IV's son, the famed Henry V, Victor of Agincourt, momentarily stitched the realm together with triumph and steel. But glory is no heirloom. His early death left a child on the throne, Henry VI, tender of spirit, devout, and wholly unfit to carry the weight of a kingdom burdened with unresolved sins. This was the fragile world into which prophecy stepped. It is whispered that a monk, half seer, half scribe, once penned a dream that haunted kings, that England would be torn by dragons, born of the same mother, that the realm would drown in roses, and that 2 stars, alike in fire, would fall from the same sky and tear the world beneath them. Was it merely metaphor, a story told in candlelight to frighten or amuse? Perhaps. But the English, weary from war with France, taxed to their bones, and caught between a mad king and scheming nobles, began to see signs everywhere. The House of Lancaster bore the red rose, bold, full, and fierce. The House of York chose the white, pale, precise, and silent. Yet neither flower was native to war. These were not battle flags. Not yet. They were emblems, symbols embroidered into lineage long before swords were drawn. But once the soil was soaked in blood, meaning grew wild around them. The deeper tension, of course, was not only in crowns and colors, but in memory, in the long resentment of those denied their birthright. Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, stood at the fulcrum of this tension, his blood, running from both Lionel of Antwerp and Edmund of Langley, made him a man of ancient entitlement. He looked upon King Henry VI and saw not only weakness, but usurpation wrapped in piety. Yet Richard was no mere rebel. He served the king with loyalty, led armies in France, governed Ireland. But each favor curdled with time. The court, wary of his ambition, whispered of his pride. And those whispers carried weight, for in the shadows behind the throne stood Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife to the fragile Henry, sharp as winter wind and French by birth. She saw in York not a cousin, but a threat. And she, more than any, would become the furnace of Lancaster's rage. But all this, the names, the roses, the tangled vines of succession, existed first in silence. The war had not yet begun. Not truly. What stirred in the hearts of men had yet to break into flame. Still, the land felt it. The people of England, peasants and nobles alike, walked through a quiet unease, as if the past had begun to rise again from the ground beneath them. Whispers of forgotten grievances bloomed in the minds of barons. Old promises were recalled, old scores reawakened. And somewhere in the back of every chapel, behind every coronation hymn, there echoed the monk's old dream of roses that bleed, of brothers at war, of thrones built not on stone, but on graves. For the war to come was never truly about law. It was about memory. And memory, once stirred, does not go quietly. It lingers like incense in a ruined cathedral. It clings like dust to a forgotten crown. And so we leave the roots behind, for now, and begin to ascend the vine, toward ambition, toward betrayal, toward a garden that will soon become a grave. Sleep now, with these names blooming faintly in your thoughts. York, Lancaster, Richard, Margaret, Henry, roses of red and white. For soon the soil of England will decide which flower truly holds the sun. The air grew tense, like a drum stretched too tight. England stood divided, not yet in war, but in thought, in fear, and in quiet allegiance. The House of York had not yet declared its fury, but its shadow had lengthened. Richard, Duke of York, moved not as a traitor, but as a man bound by blood and duty. Or so he would say, and many would believe. Yet in every step he took, from council to court, from battlefield to chamber, there stirred the faint thunder of change. He was no wild rebel. He did not raise arms in haste, but in his bearing there was iron, and in his cause, calculation. York had served faithfully in France, governed Ireland with firm grace, and returned to England expecting reward. Instead, he found himself cast aside. The royal court, bending beneath the will of Queen Margaret and her favoured lords, placed its trust in Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a man York considered unfit and dishonourable, yet who basked in the Queen's favour. Thus the realm, like a mirror touched by frost, began to crack. The common folk looked to York with uneasy hope. He was of noble stock, decisive and, most importantly, not Henry. Their king, though well-meaning, had drifted into silence. His mind frayed like old cloth. He wandered from thought to prayer, speaking little, commanding less. For months he vanished into holy stupor, touched, some whispered, by God, others said by madness, and when the king sleeps, others speak. In 1453, the silence deepened. Henry VI, overcome by mental collapse, could not respond to the birth of his own son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. A child born to reign, perhaps, but also to ignite division. For with the king's mind broken, England needed a hand to guide the realm. Parliament, once cautious, turned to Richard of York. He was named Protector of the Realm, a title not quite king, but close enough to echo treason in the ears of Lancaster loyalists. The court split like firewood under a blade. To the Yorkists, this was necessity. To the Lancastrians, and to Queen Margaret, it was heresy clothed in reason. The Queen, fierce and unwavering, withdrew with her son, weaving alliances in the north, planting seeds of war. And so England stood with two centres, two pulses, two roses waiting to bloom into swords. The nobles, ever attuned to the winds of power, began to choose. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, cast his lot with York. Charismatic, ruthless, and endlessly ambitious, Warwick would become known as the Kingmaker, a man who would raise and topple monarchs with the flick of his mailed hand. To York's cause he brought wealth, soldiers, and something deeper, momentum. Yet not all nobles followed. The Percys, loyal to Lancaster, stirred in the north. The Staffords, Beauforts, and other ancient houses hedged their bets or bared their teeth. Brothers turned their gazes toward one another across tables, each wondering which side their blood might betray. What had begun as a dispute over royal advisers had begun to feel like destiny. Then came the spark. In May of 1455, York and his allies marched towards St. Albans, not openly to rebel, but to advise the king and demand the dismissal of Somerset. Yet arms were carried, banners flown, and the meeting ended not in talk, but in blood. The first battle of St. Albans was brief, but it cracked history open. Somerset fell, slain in the street. The king, wounded and dazed, was captured by York's men. York knelt before him, swearing loyalty, but in the eyes of many, the line had been crossed. Royal blood had been spilled. There could be no turning back. England, realm of cathedrals and ploughmen, of abbeys and alehouses, had awakened into civil war, not all at once. Not with fire and trumpet, but like a slow, relentless tide, pulling men from hearth to sword, from kinship to vendetta. It would rise and recede again and again, for decades to come. For now, York stood ascendant. He was once more named Protector. The court, bruised and frightened, allowed it. Queen Margaret, however, retreated and waited, watching, gathering, whispering through the north. She saw what few yet understood, that this was no mere quarrel of nobles. This was a reckoning. In the months to follow, Henry would recover, partially, and York would be dismissed once more. But the balance had shifted. The illusion of peace had been broken, and with every move made, with every favor granted or withheld, the realm inched closer toward open flame. The country divided not only by loyalty, but by dream. Some dreamed of York, of order, of strong governance, of rightful inheritance. Others dreamed of Lancaster, of loyalty, of continuity, of the divine right of the crown, however frail its bearer. Between them lay the fields of England, green and waiting. Between them lay destiny, quiet and terrible. So rest now, for the realm has stirred, and in the hush between battles, in the breath before the next storm, the names still echo. Richard of York, Margaret of Anjou, Henry the Broken King, White Rose, Red Rose, memory and prophecy. The war is not yet total, but the garden has split, and each flower now begins to thirst. If the House of York was led by strategy and bloodline, the House of Lancaster would be steeled by will, and its will was a woman's. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England, was born not of English soil, but of French ambition. Daughter of René of Anjou, her blood carried the perfumes of Provence and the legacy of distant courts. Yet she bore none of the softness expected of queens in poetry. She was no ivory saint cloaked in silence. Margaret was fire shaped into flesh, proud, cunning, and unrelenting. England was not her homeland, but it would become her battlefield. When King Henry's mind unraveled like thread from a loom, it was Margaret who gathered the strands. While her husband wandered in holy vacancy, she governed behind veils and curtains, commanding from the margins, shaping policy through favors, whispers, and alliances. But even her strength could not hold the center. The naming of York as Protector wounded her pride and sent her into cold calculation. She saw Richard not merely as a threat to Henry's reign, but to her son's future. For as long as York lived, and as long as he could claim proximity to the throne, young Edward's inheritance lay in shadow. And Margaret did not bear shadows. So she vanished, not into fear, but into the north, into that ancient landscape of mist, moors, and loyal lords who still bent the knee to Lancaster. There, the Queen stitched together her own court, one not of velvet and ceremony, but of oaths, steel, and vengeance. She summoned the fierce northern magnates, the Percys, the Cliffords, the Beauforts, men who bore blood feuds and long memories. She spoke not in legalities, but in wounds. York had stained royal blood, she reminded them. He had laid hands on the king, slain Somerset, and threatened the very root of divine kingship. They answered with swords. What rose from Margaret's exile was not just a faction, it was a counter-kingdom. She became its beating heart. Not content to wait for courts to settle titles, Margaret prepared for war, and her war would be one of attrition, fury, and faith. She took no counsel from fear. In 1459, her gambit began to move. At the Battle of Ludford Bridge, the Queen's forces, outnumbering York's, marched with the king himself as their figurehead. Faced with the horror of raising arms directly against Henry, many of York's men deserted under cover of night. Loyalty, however bitter, still clung to the crown. Richard of York fled to Ireland. His sons, Edward and Richard, boys then, escaped to Calais with the Earl of Warwick. And Margaret moved swiftly. She convened the Parliament of Devils in Coventry, a gathering named for its venom. There she condemned York and his supporters as traitors. Lands were seized, titles stripped, heads demanded. The Queen had drawn her line in the soil. There would be no return to counsel or compromise. Only the sword could settle the matter now. Yet for all her triumph, Margaret had misjudged one thing. Exile sharpens resolve. In the spring of 1460, the Yorkists returned. Warwick, the kingmaker, landed in Kent, greeted not as a rebel, but as a redeemer. The people, weary of court corruption and northern violence, welcomed him as a noble avenger. The city of London opened its gates. Parliament was summoned once more, this time without the Queen's shadow looming. Then, like thunder rolling from the sea, York returned from Ireland, not as a servant of the king, but as a claimant. In Westminster, before lords and clergy, Richard of York strode to the throne and placed his hand upon it. The court gasped. No man had done such a thing in living memory, not even in ambition. He did not kneel. His meaning was clear. The crown should be his. But Parliament hesitated. The blood of Henry still pulsed with divine right. Though they would not grant Richard the throne, they offered compromise. Henry would remain king for life, but upon his death, the crown would pass to York, not to the young Prince Edward. It was a death sentence for Margaret's son, and Margaret heard. Fury bore wings. She gathered her allies in the north and marched with a fury that cracked the sky. In December of 1460, York marched north to meet her. Snow clung to the hills, and the air smelled of frozen iron. At Sandal Castle, near Wakefield, York emerged to face Lancaster's gathered might. He underestimated her resolve and her army's numbers. On December 30th, the Battle of Wakefield unfurled like a crimson banner. York's forces were overwhelmed. He was cut down in the chaos, his body desecrated, his head crowned with paper and set upon a spike. His son, Edmund, the young Earl of Rutland, only 17, was slaughtered while fleeing. Some say by Clifford himself, as revenge for his own father's death. Margaret had struck her blow. Yet the Queen's victory was not without shadow. The cruelty shown to York's corpse sent shivers through England. Sympathy stirred. For in death, Richard seemed more martyr than rebel. And now, another shadow stirred. York's eldest son, Edward, tall, golden-haired, and only 18, gathered the remnants of his father's banner. Beside him stood Warwick, the tireless kingmaker. Together, they would not mourn, they would rise. But tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember this. It was a queen who refused to kneel, who dared to match princes, who made battlefields of palaces and chessboards of bloodlines. The red rose had struck, but the garden was not yet hers. The war had only just begun to burn. The air in London trembled with rumours, like smoke clinging to stone. The year was 1461, and England, still reeling from the death of Richard of York, now turned its weary eyes toward a boy barely grown, a son of war, carved from his father's ruin. Edward Plantagenet, Earl of March, stood in his father's place, not bowed with grief, but lifted by fire. He was 18, golden-haired and broad-shouldered, his bearing regal, his voice steady. If Richard had been principle and patience, Edward was motion and flame. The people looked upon him and did not see mourning. They saw a banner raised anew, a lion rising from the ashes. He would not seek justice with parchment. His answer to Wakefield would be war. Margaret of Anjou had torn the heart from York, but in doing so, she had forged a new weapon, a son who would not forget. And beside him, as ever, was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, whose loyalty to York's blood burned brighter than his own ambitions. Together, they became the twin flames of the Yorkist cause, youth and guile, fury and strategy. In February 1461, Edward's army met Lancaster at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, and the sky became omen. As dawn broke over the frost-bitten fields, 3 suns burned in the sky, a rare parhelion. Soldiers paused in awe. Whispers passed, the sign of the Trinity, the favor of God. Edward saw it and declared it a divine blessing, a vision of his own strength, of York reborn threefold in his brothers, Edward, George, and Richard. The omen burned in the minds of men as Lancaster's army was shattered. But victory's song was short. Weeks later, Margaret and her northern army surged southward, looting as they came. Towns burned, churches wept, London braced for siege. But the city gates held, not to soldiers, but to fear. The Queen's army, though mighty, was cruel and ravenous. London would not yield to fire. It turned instead to the promise of Edward. So it was, on a chill March morning, Edward of York entered the capital not as prince, but as king. No parliament had crowned him. No bishop placed a scepter in his hand. He claimed the throne not through ritual, but through right, and the will of the people. He declared himself King Edward IV of England, 19 years old, unproven, uncrowned. Yet England, tired of madness and blood, took a breath. And then the snows fell. Lancaster would not vanish. Margaret still rode with her son, her will iron. She summoned her armies to meet Edward near the town of Towton, in Yorkshire, where the wind always howled, and where destiny would write its cruelest stanza. Palm Sunday, 1461. Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Blizzards of snow tore through the sky, slanting into the faces of the Lancastrians. Visibility was near none. The ground, soaked in frost, became mud and memory. Arrows screamed through the storm like whispers of vengeance. The armies met in feral rage, tens of thousands on each side. The clash was not swift, it was not noble, it was agony stretched into hours. Swords broke against bone, men drowned in snow churned with blood. The dead lay in drifts. By nightfall, the white fields of Yorkshire had turned crimson. Lancaster was broken. Thousands fled. Thousands more did not rise again. The red rose had been buried beneath the snow. Edward was king, not just in name, but in victory, in power, in awe. At Easter, he entered York, the city his father had once dreamed to rule, and saw the head of Richard still mounted above the gates. He ordered it taken down and replaced with those who had raised hands against his house. The lion had returned to his den. Yet even in triumph, Edward's story did not settle into peace. Victory brought challenges of its own. A kingdom won by war is not easily held by peace. Edward was young. He ruled through strength, yes, but also through charm. He was a knight of grand presence, fond of tournaments, handsome in armor, irresistible to many. But behind the courtly dances and silk pennants, his decisions carved deep fault lines. Most famously, he wed in secret. In 1464, he shocked his advisers and enraged Warwick by marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, a widow, a Lancastrian by blood. Warwick, who had negotiated a royal marriage to a French princess, saw this act as betrayal. The kingmaker, who had placed Edward on the throne, now found himself shut out by the very king he had made. Thus, from within York itself, the seeds of conflict began to bloom. But for now, as bells tolled through London and incense swirled in the chapels, Edward IV sat upon the throne, crowned not just by ritual, but by the will of steel. His brothers, George of Clarence and Richard of Gloucester, stood beside him. Margaret and her son had fled across the sea. Henry, broken and without crown, drifted in the shadows like a ghost of England's past. And so, for a time, the White Rose stood tall. It basked in the sun of Edward's youth, unaware of the gathering dusk. Because wars do not end when thrones are claimed. They end when memory fades, and memory, in England, remembers too well. So sleep now. The battlefield is still. The crown gleams in the candlelight, but beneath the floorboards of fate, something shifts. Quietly. Because the kingmaker is watching, the queen is waiting, the tide is not done, and no rose blooms forever. The crown is aflame. It warms, it dazzles, it burns, and the hands that raise it are not always those that hold it forever. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, once the wind beneath Edward's wings, was a man shaped by power and pride. His name whispered through the corridors of England, the kingmaker, the architect of crowns, the weaver of alliances, the hand that lifted a boy to a throne. Yet even kings bow before the tempest of ambition. Warwick had seen the throne from its highest peaks and deepest shadows. He had brokered treaties, quelled rebellions, and stitched together fragile peace. But Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville struck at the heart of Warwick's design. A marriage arranged in the shadows to a woman of lesser blood whose family sought to elevate itself with sudden riches and power. The kingmaker's fury was a quiet storm, gathering beyond the gilded walls of court. The Woodvilles moved swiftly. They filled the king's council with their kin, ambitious, eager, and unknown to the ancient nobility. They pushed Warwick aside, his influence waning like a dying star. This was no mere betrayal of friendship. It was a fracturing of the kingdom's very soul. Warwick's pride became a wound, his wound a cause for revolt. By 1469, the man who had crowned Edward now turned against him. Whispers of rebellion crept through the northern shires. Warwick allied himself with discontented lords and Lancastrian sympathizers, weaving together a tapestry of unrest. The king's own brother, George of Clarence, drawn by promises and envy, sided with Warwick, a serpent biting at the House of York from within. Warwick's army marched toward London, a shadow beneath the sunlit throne. In the summer's heat, Edward was captured, betrayed by those he trusted. The king was imprisoned, and for a brief moment, the throne seemed to sway. Warwick placed Henry VI back upon the throne, a ghost reborn, a king without mind, but with a crown. England held its breath, but the lion is not so easily caged. Edward escaped. He returned to battle with a fury that shook the earth. At the Battle of Barnet, April 1471, the skies thundered, lightning slicing the darkened heavens. Warwick rode among the smoke and screams, but fate was not his ally. The kingmaker fell. His body, pierced by arrows and steel, was left on the field, a kingless kingmaker. Yet the war was not done. 2 months later, at Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian forces met their doom. Prince Edward, Margaret's son, died on that field. The last hope of Lancaster extinguished like a candle in the wind. The Queen herself was captured, broken, and exiled, and Henry VI, the Mad King, disappeared into shadows, his life extinguished quietly in the Tower. Edward IV reclaimed his throne, but the scars ran deep. Betrayal had come not just from enemies, but from blood and bond. The war had torn England's soul in two, and in the silence that followed, the whispered question lingered. Who, in the end, would wear the crown? Victory, it seemed, had returned to Edward IV. The roses of Lancaster had withered on the fields of Barnet and Tewkesbury. Henry VI, the broken king, lay dead in the Tower, whether by grief or dagger, none could say. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was a prisoner, her cause undone, and Edward, the boy who had risen from the snows of Towton, now stood unchallenged, draped in velvet, crowned in gold. But no crown rests without shadows, though the banners of war were furled, and England lulled into a fragile peace, the cracks beneath the throne widened. Edward, now in the full blaze of his kingship, ruled with confidence, but not without vice. He was handsome still, towering and golden, beloved by the court and feared by his foes. Yet indulgence crept into his reign. The king grew fond of pleasures, feasting, hunting, women, laughter that echoed too late into the night. He had won the war, but he had not quieted his house. The wound left by Warwick's rebellion festered, especially in the heart of George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's brother. Clarence, once the boy swept into treason by the kingmaker, had been pardoned. He had bent the knee, offered fealty, and resumed his place in the glittering court. But Clarence's ambitions burned behind his hollow smiles. He envied Edward's power, resented his younger brother Richard's closeness to the king, and brooded over what might have been had Warwick's dream succeeded. He was a man of contradictions, brave in battle, weak in will, loyal in word, treacherous in deed. And he was a danger. Edward watched, waited, warned. Clarence plotted, murmured, drifted into darker company. It was not one deed that doomed him, but many. Slow drips of poison into the cup of trust. Accusations of sorcery, secret dealings, talk of Clarence forging his own claim to the throne. Whether true or false, the king saw enough. And so, in 1478, the axe fell. Not on the battlefield, but within the Tower. They say Clarence was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a cruel jest turned execution. Whether myth or memory, the truth is simpler. Edward killed his brother to save his crown, and in doing so, tore another thread from the fabric of York. Now only two sons of York remained, Edward, the king, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the quiet shadow who had watched, listened, and never once turned away. Richard was not as golden as his brothers. He was wiry, dark-haired, solemn, his back slightly hunched from birth. But there was steel in his eyes and loyalty in his heart. He had fought beside Edward in every battle, never wavered, never rebelled, and so Edward trusted him more than any man alive. He gave him the north, the fortress of the realm, the cradle of rebellion. Richard ruled there with firm grace, marrying Anne Neville, daughter of Warwick, and binding old enemies to the House of York. Peace, it seemed, might finally hold, but fate, as ever, lingered in the wings. In the spring of 1483, Edward IV fell ill. He had not yet reached his 41st year. Whispers ran through the palace. The king, once so full of life, so vast in appetite, now lay pale and breathless, his limbs failing him. The physicians offered little. He faded slowly, like a candle in still air. Before his final breath, Edward named his young son, Edward, Prince of Wales, as heir, a boy of 12. Bright-eyed, gentle, too young to rule alone, and so Edward appointed his brother Richard as Lord Protector, guardian of the boy king, keeper of the realm, and then he died. April 1483. The golden sun of York went out, and with it peace unraveled, for no crown placed on a child's head is safe. The Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, feared what would follow. She moved swiftly, gathering allies, seeking to control the council, to surround her son with Woodville power. But Richard was faster. He rode south, intercepted the young king's retinue at Stony Stratford, and took the boy under his care. He declared it was to protect him, to shield the realm from Woodville ambition. The Queen fled into sanctuary at Westminster, her remaining children clutched to her breast. Richard brought the boy to the Tower, not as prisoner, but as preparation for coronation, or so it seemed. And then, day by day, shadow deepened. The coronation was delayed. The Queen's kin were arrested, executed, and rumors spread that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth had not been lawful, that the princes were illegitimate, that the true heir was Richard himself, and then the throne was no longer empty. July 1483. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. The boy king, Edward V, was never crowned. He and his younger brother disappeared within the Tower and were never seen again. The roses, once white and red, had turned to ash. And England, once more, held its breath. It began with a crown resting on uncertain brows, and it would end with one hurled from a dying hand into brambled thorns. Richard III sat the throne, crowned not by inheritance, but by necessity, by claim, by the absence of any stronger hand. His reign, born of suspicion and silence, was brief and battered, though he ruled with justice in mind, passing laws to aid the poor, to correct corruptions of land and coin. The shadow of the Tower cloaked him. For all his proclamations of peace, the realm heard only the silence of the princes. Two boys vanished, Edward and Richard, heirs of the late king, their blood the last line of York's purest claim. They were last seen behind stone walls and iron bars, guarded not by soldiers, but by time and whatever guilt could not be named. Some whispered they had died. Others said they had escaped, but none saw them again. And so the throne beneath Richard trembled, not for what he did, but for what the world believed. From across the sea came the answer. Henry Tudor, a young man with a sliver of Lancastrian blood and a banner painted red, watched from exile in Brittany. He had no great army, no royal lineage unbroken, but he had hope, and he had allies. English lords disenchanted with York, and French gold eager to meddle. The red rose of Lancaster, nearly wilted to nothing, opened again. In the summer of 1485, Henry sailed for England with barely a few thousand men. But fate, always hungry for drama, gave him more than a soldier's chance. Richard had alienated too many, those he had executed, those he had overlooked, those who feared the stain of the princes might one day soil them too. On the morning of August 22nd, on a quiet rise in Leicestershire known as Bosworth Field, the future of England waited to be written. Richard rode into battle clad in black armor, his white boar gleaming on his standard. He fought like a man who knew how kingdoms are made, with steel, not parchment. He led the charge himself, seeking out Henry directly to end the threat before it could bloom. But betrayal rode beside him. The Stanley family, whose armies loomed on the field's edge, refused to commit to Richard's side. Thomas Stanley, whose son was held hostage by the king, hesitated, and at the final moment turned. His cavalry joined Henry's charge, crashing into Richard's flank. Richard saw the tide turn and did not flee. He rode into the press of spears like a lion caged. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer. He came within a sword's length of the boy he sought to kill. But numbers overcame fury, and there, beneath a tangle of banners, Richard III was struck down. The last king of England to die in battle. They found his body stripped and broken, tossed across a horse's back, paraded through the streets of Leicester with jeers and dirt and bitter glee. The crown, his crown, was found among the brambles, tangled in thorns and blood. It was placed on Henry Tudor's head by Lord Stanley there on the battlefield. The age of York was ended, and the age of Tudor had begun. Yet the war was not over, not truly, for battles may end in hours, but wounds linger for generations. Henry VII, the new king, married Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV, to unite the red and white roses, to stitch England back into a single, fragile bloom. He created a new emblem, the Tudor rose, red layered on white, a symbol of peace forged in marriage and memory. But no rose grows without thorns. Though he ruled with cunning and caution, Henry's reign was dogged by doubt, pretenders claiming to be the lost princes, rebellions blooming like weeds, the old enmities lingering beneath his every step. Yet his crown held. The Tudors endured, and in time, history softened its gaze. Richard III, once villain, usurper, child killer, would be reimagined, rewritten, reinterpreted. His bones, lost for centuries, were found in 2012 beneath a car park in Leicester, his spine curved, his skull cracked by a blade. A king unburied, a past unearthed. He was reburied in a cathedral, mourned not as a monster, but as a man. And thus the War of the Roses, decades of blood and crown, of brother against brother, mother against son, came to its quiet conclusion. Not with a sword, but with silence, with a marriage, with a grave, and with a question that haunts every throne. What is power, if not the shadow it casts? The battlefield had fallen quiet. No banners cracked in the wind. No cries rose from dying mouths. Only the distant moan of the earth as it swallowed its final king and made room for another. Henry Tudor stood, still damp with sweat and blood, amid the trampled wildflowers of Bosworth field. A crown, bent, bloodied, and torn from a dying man's brow, was pressed onto his head by a hand that had once sworn loyalty to York. Thus did Henry VII become king, not through birthright, nor parliament, nor prayer, but through the naked right of conquest, and the realm exhaled. But peace, real peace, is never instant. It does not arrive on horseback or on the point of a sword. It creeps in, cautious, bruised, unwilling to trust. The wounds of the roses ran too deep for mere victory to seal. So Henry began, not as a king, but as a healer. He looked not to the bloodshed behind him, but to the bloodlines still bleeding. In January of 1486, in the heart of Westminster, Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, sister of the lost princes, and Rose of the White Line. The union, more than a political gesture, was a sacred binding. Red and white, once bitter petals, were sewn together on altar cloth and royal standard. From this union emerged a new sigil, the Tudor rose, white rose within red, two claims fused into a single bloom. It was a symbol of unity, of ending, of beginning. But beneath its petals lay silence, for though Henry ruled with a steady hand, he never forgot how easily crowns were lost, nor how many still doubted his own. He had no clear right to the throne. His claim traced through a forgotten bastard line, through Margaret Beaufort, his mother, whose fierce faith and quiet cunning had kept his name alive during exile. So he ruled not as a king beloved, but as one who feared ghosts. He made his court watchful, his laws sharp. He taxed not only coin, but loyalty. He clipped the wings of the old nobility, those who had danced too freely in the reigns before, and surrounded himself with clerks, lawyers, servants of silence rather than sword. And yet, rebellion stirred like smoke behind stone. In 1487, a boy named Lambert Simnel appeared, claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, a Yorkist heir long imprisoned in the Tower. Behind him stood John de la Pole, a nephew of Richard III, and thousands of Irish soldiers eager to unsettle England once more. Henry met them at Stoke Field. It was the last battle of the War of the Roses. The rebels were crushed. The boy pretender, Simnel, was captured. And in a gesture both strange and wise, Henry spared him. He made the child a scullery servant in the royal kitchens. Let him live. Let him serve. Let him be seen. It was not mercy alone. It was message. The crown, Henry meant to say, could not be stolen by mimicry. It had been won with steel, sealed in marriage, blessed by the silence of his enemies. But even silence is loud in England. Another pretender rose, Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the two lost princes. For nearly a decade, he haunted Henry's reign, gathering support from Scotland, from Burgundy, from those who believed or hoped the White Rose had survived. Henry endured. He captured Warbeck in 1497, and after a year in chains, executed him. Then, at last, the winds quieted. The old lords aged or died. The new nobility, loyal to Tudor, bound by fear or favor, replaced them. The people, wearied by war, learned to call Henry's peace not tyranny, but stability. And from that silence bloomed something rare in England: order. The treasury filled, trade flowed, roads were mended, ports opened. Law, once bent by noble whim, was written in firmer ink. Henry, though never adored, was respected, and his crown, once stitched from conquest and compromise, hardened into legitimacy. In time, he produced heirs. Arthur, his firstborn, destined for greatness, betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, and Henry, the second son, watchful and clever, who would one day be king. But this peace, like all things, was mortal. Arthur died young. Catherine remained, and into this space of fate and failure stepped Henry, the younger. When Henry VII died in 1509, he left behind not a battlefield, but a dynasty. And in his son, Henry VIII, the embers of war would flare into fire again. Not between roses, but between church and crown, body and soul, king and God. Yet that is another story. The War of the Roses had ended, not with a roar, but with a rose, red and white, blooming in silence. Its thorns were many, its petals stained, but it endured. And beneath it, a New England rose, cautious, wounded, but whole. A kingdom once torn by the passions of cousins and kings now looked towards something beyond survival. Legacy. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson of the roses. That war may take generations to end, and longer still to understand. That peace is not a moment, but a memory, planted in silence, blooming in time. And that history, like a rose, carries both beauty and blood in every fold. It is said that time buries the dead, but memory tends their graves. The War of the Roses had drawn its last breath. The swords were sheathed, the claimants gone, and yet, in the quiet that followed, echoes began to whisper, not from courtiers or commons, but from the realm beyond history, the realm of myth, omen, and dream. For England, ever ancient, does not forget. Even when peace settles like mist over field and tower, the old stories stir beneath the soil. The princes in the tower, the boar struck down in the thorns, the boy in the kitchen who once wore a crown of lies. Ghosts, all of them, not of the dead alone, but of identity. What is a king, if not the belief of his people? What is power, if not memory dressed in ceremony? The Tudors knew this. Henry VII ruled with silence, but his son, Henry VIII, ruled with thunder. And in his court, among the painted ceilings and burning candles, the Rose of England was reimagined, no longer merely a symbol of reconciliation, but of divine right. The red and the white became the face of a new legend, the Tudor destiny. And yet, beneath the surface, the old war still lingered, not in armies, but in blood. For prophecy, too, had survived Bosworth. Long before swords were drawn at St. Albans, long before the Tower swallowed the princes, a whisper had passed through the monasteries and halls. A prophecy older than the Tudors, older even than Lancaster and York, that England would be torn in twain by the sons of a lion, that blood would fall from a broken crown, that a sleeping king would return when the realm was again in need. Some said this king was Arthur, others Richard. Still others, a figure yet unborn, but prophecy needs no truth, only belief. And belief still clung to the corners of the realm. In the north, old families remembered Richard III not as villain, but as protector. In the west, murmurs claimed the princes still lived. In the countryside, songs were sung, softly, secretly, of roses that bloomed in winter, of crowns found in rivers, of battles yet to come. The Tudors tried to still these songs. They rewrote the past with pen and portrait. Chroniclers reshaped the Yorkists into villains and Richard into a hunchbacked usurper. Artists painted Henry as Apollo reborn. Even the rose itself was redrawn as its thorns smoothed, its petals widened, its scent sweetened for a new era. And for a time, it worked. The old war faded from law, from ledgers, from prayer. Generations grew, who knew only one king at a time. But the echoes remained. In 1592, more than a century after Richard's fall, a playwright took up his name, William Shakespeare, writing not for truth, but for theatre, resurrected the last Yorkist king in ink and iambic verse. He made him twisted in body, serpentine in soul, a man who murdered his nephews, seduced with malice, and died alone, crying for a horse. It was genius, it was art, and it sealed Richard's fate. For history, when performed well enough, becomes belief, and belief becomes legacy. Shakespeare did not invent the villain, but he crowned him. And thus, through theatre, the War of the Roses lived again. Not on fields, but on stages. Not in blood, but in breath. Yet even here, ambiguity crept. For in Shakespeare's verse, Richard is not simply wicked, he is tragic. A man shaped by fate, cursed by birth, lashing against a world that refuses him love. In this portrayal, a strange sympathy grew. And centuries later, when Richard's bones were found beneath a parking lot in Leicester, spine curved, skull cleaved, the nation turned not with scorn, but with reverence. He was reburied as a king. Thousands gathered, flowers were laid, bells tolled, and the whispers began anew. Had he truly killed the princes? Was he the villain we were taught, or had history too chosen a victor? In this moment, the War of the Roses revealed its final truth, that no war ever truly ends. Not in sword nor treaty, nor even in time. It lingers in the questions we do not ask, the stories we choose to tell, the graves we tend with trembling hands. The Tudors are long gone now. Their dynasty ended with Elizabeth I, who died without heir, the last petal on a carefully grafted rose. But the legacy they forged, the unity of red and white, the myth of the noble king, the quiet shaping of memory, still blooms in every corner of England, in church windows, in royal pageants, in the way we speak of power, betrayal, destiny. The War of the Roses was more than family feud, more than succession crisis. It was a mirror held to the face of monarchy itself, asking again and again, who deserves the crown? Is it he who inherits or he who dares? Is legitimacy a matter of blood or belief? And if we forget the answers, will the war begin again? Perhaps not in steel, but in soul. So let the echoes sing, let the petals fall, and let us walk softly among their ruins. For in every age the roses wait, and in every king the war sleeps, dreaming of thorns. A kingdom remembers not only through monuments and poems, but through the bones it buries. Beneath the velvet carpets of Westminster, Beneath the cracked stones of Leicester and the windswept chapels of Yorkshire lie the bones of kings, queens, and claimants, curled in silence, mouths forever sealed. Some were mourned, others forgotten. A few, unearthed centuries later, were given names once more, but all belong to the garden England tends in secret, the Garden of Bones. And in that garden, dynasties bloom and crumble like petals kissed by frost. The Tudors, whose rise ended the War of the Roses, ruled not as children of peace, but as gardeners of legacy. They knew how quickly blood dries and how fragile the crown becomes when memory is left untended. So they curated remembrance. Henry VII, the founder, planted his line with caution, pruning rivals, watering alliances, fencing off rebellion with laws sharp as blades. His son, Henry VIII, uprooted England's faith itself, severing from Rome and casting down monasteries, reshaping religion to fit a single crown. Where once roses had warred, now saints were burned. Yet even as the Tudors stretched toward empire, their roots thinned. Henry VIII sired 3 children: Edward, frail and brilliant; Mary, fervent and flame-eyed; Elizabeth, cunning and alone. Each ruled in turn, and each died without heir. Their dynasty, forged in the blood of Lancaster and York, withered after only 3 generations. And still, England endured. This is the quiet truth of power. No matter how grand the lineage, it ends in silence. A breath, a bed, a burial. Edward VI died young, coughing blood. Mary I died childless, her dream of restoring Catholicism fading like incense from an empty altar. Elizabeth I ruled longest and perhaps best, but she left no seed behind. She died in a golden gown beneath faded tapestries of her father's wars, the virgin queen whose womb bore only myth. And with her, the Tudor rose fell. But from the soil where it rotted, new growth came. The Stewarts, distant cousins from the northern hills of Scotland, inherited the crown not through conquest, but bloodline. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, a union of crowns, not of hearts. And the roses, they lingered still, not in arms, but in ideas, in art, in suspicion, in the quiet terror of every monarch who followed, wondering whether the same thorns that pierced York and Lancaster might find them too, for the Garden of Bones does not forget. Centuries later, in a quiet parking lot in Leicester, a skeleton was unearthed beneath cracked asphalt and humming cars. Curved spine, cleft skull, narrow grave. Richard III, the last Yorkist king, buried without ceremony, slandered in memory, returned to the light, and suddenly the old war returned. Not in armies, but in questions. Who gets to shape history? Who deserves a crown? Is a king what he does, or what he leaves behind? The War of the Roses had ended in 1487, but the reckoning of it, its meaning, its inheritance, never truly ceased. It shaped not only royal lines, but the soul of a nation. Even now, its echoes can be heard. In Shakespeare's verse, in the emblems of Parliament, in the red and white of football scarves and school crests, in the cautious way power is handed down, in the way England fears civil fracture, dreads royal scandal, clings to memory like ivy on old stone. The garden grows, sometimes lush, sometimes brittle, and within it lie not just the Tudors and Plantagenets, but all the dreams they carried. Arthur's sword, Edward's glory, Richard's regret, Elizabeth's fire, each bone a story, each grave a root. Dynasties do not vanish. They fade, yes, into marble, into coin, into whisper. But their essence lingers. Every coronation is a resurrection, every rebellion a shadow, and every war is a lesson. The War of the Roses taught England this, that legitimacy, once questioned, can consume a nation. That cousin can kill cousin under the banner of justice. That peace cannot be decreed. It must be grown, season by season, with care and memory and humility, and that even the most beautiful rose may draw blood. So we walk gently now, through palaces that once held rebels, through halls where usurpers were crowned, through gardens where roses bloom, unaware of the swords once drawn in their name, and beneath our feet the bones wait, not vengeful, not proud, just patient, for history, like the soil, takes what it is given and offers back meaning if we are willing to listen. Thus ends the tale of the Tudors, the gardeners who ended a war and began another. Thus begins the silence between dynasties, the quiet from which legacy grows, and still in England's heart the roses bloom, not in rivalry now, but in remembrance, red for courage, white for sorrow, and in their joining, unity, fragile and fleeting, but still alive, still waiting to be tended, still echoing through time. The crown sits heavy, not only with gold and jewels, but with thorns hidden beneath its gilded frame. Power, even divine, is never without its betrayals. Within the tangled branches of the Plantagenet family tree, betrayal grew like wild ivy, creeping, strangling, and strangling some of the brightest lives before their time. The War of the Roses was not merely a war between houses, it was a war within a family, where brother turned on brother, uncle on nephew, and father on son. The thorns beneath the crown are the silent fractures that rip the fabric of trust, where love and ambition clash beneath the surface. Consider the story of Edward IV and his brothers. Edward, once a young knight crowned king in a chapel soaked with candlelight, seemed destined to restore peace to England. Yet his younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, was a thorn in the side of his reign, a man whose envy and resentment would lead him to betray blood itself. George's ambition, sharp and cruel, drove him first into rebellion, then to secret plots, and finally to a death in the Tower, drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, or so the rumor says. It was a death whispered in shadows, a warning etched in silence. No brother was safe when the crown burned with desire. Even Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stood beneath this storm of suspicion and treachery. Once loyal, once the kingmaker's sword, Richard's path darkened as the war deepened. After Edward's sudden death, Richard seized the throne, declaring his nephews illegitimate and disappearing the princes in the Tower. His betrayal was not only political, but deeply personal, the shattering of a family trust that had once seemed unbreakable. Yet these betrayals were not new. They echoed the old stories of Cain and Abel, of brothers divided by jealousy and fear. They were as ancient as the land itself. Because the crown breeds suspicion, it isolates its bearer, making every smile a possible dagger, every embrace a trap. And so the royal line splintered, torn not only by battles and alliances, but by the wounds inflicted within. The Lancastrians, too, knew betrayal's bite. Margaret of Anjou, fierce and unyielding, stood at the heart of Lancastrian resistance. Her husband, Henry VI, gentle and devout, was a king of peace but a ruler of fragile mind. Their son, Edward of Westminster, was a hope for the future, yet even he could not escape the shadow of treachery. The Lancastrian camp was riven by internal dissent and desperation, nobles turning on one another, families fractured by fear of loyalty. The war was not a simple tale of good and evil, but a tapestry woven with pain, grief, and broken bonds. In these betrayals, the human cost of ambition is laid bare. Fathers who condemned sons, sons who defied fathers, brothers who slew brothers, and queens whose love turned to steel. The crown was no longer a symbol of divine right, but a crucible of human frailty. Betrayal became a language spoken in court chambers and battlefields alike. Yet, Even in this darkness, the story reveals something sacred. For every thorn beneath the crown is a reminder of the delicate balance between power and love, between duty and desire, between the hope for unity and the reality of division. It teaches us that no dynasty can flourish without trust, and no reign can endure without forgiveness. And in the silence after betrayal, in the space where trust once lived, a new story begins. Of reconciliation, of memory, of legacy. The War of the Roses was a story of thorns, but also of petals that dared to bloom after storms. So, as we walk this ancient path, let us remember the cost beneath the crown, and honor the courage it takes to forgive, to rebuild, and to love again. War is not only a clash of armies, but a symphony of senses, an orchestra where the breath of earth itself is drawn into the cadence of death and hope. To walk the fields of the War of the Roses is to inhale the mingled scents of blood and soil, to hear the clash of steel and the silence that follows, to feel the trembling earth beneath boots heavy with fate. The air was thick with smoke from flaming villages, the scent of wet wool and the coppery tang of fresh blood, spilled beneath pale skies. At Towton, the largest battle of the war, snow fell in thick flakes, softening the cries of men, but not the weight of steel. The frozen breath of soldiers mingled with the acrid stench of burning flesh. War was a cruel lover, both beautiful and merciless, drawing the living and the dead into her embrace. The sound of war was chaos. The clang of swords meeting shields, the thunder of hooves pounding muddy fields, the roar of arrows slicing through the air like sharp prayers. Voices rose, cries of rage, despair, and defiance, lost beneath the thunderous chorus. And beneath it all, the quiet moments, the brief silences between storms of violence. A soldier clutching a bleeding wound, the soft sob of a mother hearing of her son's death. The stillness of a field once alive, now stained red. It was in those silences that the true cost of war was spoken. War stripped away the veneer of glory to reveal something raw and ancient. The vulnerability of human flesh, the fragility of hope. The battlefield was not merely a place of death, but a canvas of memory, painted with the breaths of thousands who had fought, loved, and lost. The ground itself remembered. Footsteps pressed deep into mud, mingling with the bones of the fallen. The wind carried whispers, prayers for peace, curses for enemies, songs for home. Even the trees, standing silent witness, seemed to mourn, their leaves trembling like tears, and in that breath, the war became more than history. It became a meditation on life itself, on the fleeting nature of power, on the fragile thread that separates victory from ruin. For every blade raised in anger, there was a heart breaking in silence. Every flag unfurled in triumph was stained with grief. The War of the Roses teaches us that war is never clean or just. It is messy, chaotic, and full of sorrow. Yet within its breath lies a lesson, the possibility of renewal. The earth that drinks blood also nourishes seeds. The silence that follows battle is not only the absence of noise, but the promise of peace. So as we close our eyes and breathe deeply, let us remember the battlefield's breath, the smell of sacrifice, the sound of courage, the silence of hope, and in that sacred space between war and peace, may we find rest. They were born in velvet cradles, wrapped in the dreams of kingdoms. Their names were whispered in prayers and written in the margins of prophecy. Edward, Richard, Edmund, and so many others. Princes, sons of kings, the seeds of legacy. But the roses bloomed from poisoned soil, and not all sons were meant to wear their father's crown. The fall of princes during the War of the Roses was not a singular moment. It was a slow undoing, a tragic unraveling across decades. Each death, a stitch pulled loose from the fabric of dynasty. Each silence, a space where a kingdom might have stood. We begin with Edward of Westminster, the only son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. He was England's last hope for the Lancastrian line. Raised in exile, hardened by war, his boyhood was forged in steel rather than sunlight. At the Battle of Tewkesbury, still only 17, he rode into the storm of history. He never rode out. Struck down either on the field or, as some whispered, murdered afterward, his death ended the direct line of Lancaster. A crown drowned in youth. Margaret, fierce lioness of a mother, was taken prisoner, and Henry VI, hollow and half-mad, died days later in the Tower, his fragile soul slipping away under mysterious hands. No banners flew for Edward after that, no monuments rose. Just silence, the kind of silence that fills a throne room emptied by ghosts. Then there were the sons of York, the very heart of that white rose triumph. Edward IV had 2 sons, Edward, Prince of Wales, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. Bright boys, golden-haired, tucked away in the Tower of London after their father's sudden death. There, in stone chambers where birds no longer sang, they vanished. The princes in the Tower. Their fate became one of history's darkest shadows. Some said their uncle, Richard III, had them killed to secure his crown. Others whispered of rival claimants, secret rescues, or impostors who later stirred rebellion. But the truth lies buried, perhaps beneath flagstones, perhaps within conscience. The image of those 2 boys, robbed of time, lingers still in the English soul. Not as monarchs, but as martyrs. Even Edmund, Earl of Rutland, younger brother of Edward IV, met a cruel fate. Barely a teenager, he was cut down after the Battle of Wakefield, crying for mercy that never came. His death, unarmed and fleeing, echoed through the halls of Sandal Castle like a child's last lullaby. These were not just political deaths. They were the ends of branches on the great tree of England, branches full of fruit, snapped by ambition and frost. Yet within these endings, new beginnings stirred. The fall of so many sons cleared a path for one more child. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian by blood, though distant and unknown to most of England. He was no prince of court. His childhood was one of hiding and exile, spent across the storm-swept coast of Brittany, far from the throne he would one day claim. But history, in its strange mercy, sometimes hides its treasures in unlikely places. After the deaths of so many would-be kings, it was Henry, quiet, cautious Henry, who gathered what was left of Lancaster and struck his fate at Bosworth. With him, a new chapter would begin, one not born of ancient claim, but of necessity, a dynasty not of divine right, but of survival. Still, the fall of the princes remains sacred, not merely for its sorrow, but for the questions it leaves behind. What is a legacy if it cannot protect its children? What is a kingdom if its heirs are buried in unmarked graves? What does it mean to be royal if royalty is only another word for sacrifice? Perhaps that is the truth of the War of the Roses. Not a battle for crowns, but a mourning of sons. It is in the echoes of their names, spoken still in towers and abbeys and ballads, that we feel the quiet gravity of history. Not every prince becomes a king, but every fallen heir becomes a mirror, reflecting who we are and what we choose to remember. Let the names of the lost be a soft breath in your chest tonight. Let the silence of their stories make space for reflection, and let the knowledge that even in their endings, England endured, that something still bloomed through the sorrow, be your peace. For even when the roses fell, the garden did not die. By the 16th year of the wars, England was not a kingdom. It was a shadow. Not broken, no, but weary, stretched. A harp whose strings had been played too long, too hard, until every note trembled with ache. There had once been songs of glory, of noble charges, of banners lifted in righteous wind. But now the songs were quieter, almost murmured, sung by widows to orphaned sons, by blacksmiths who no longer forged swords, but shovels to bury their kin. This was the descent. Not a single fall, but a slow withering, like candle wax melting along the altar, unnoticed until the flame trembled and fell. The nobles, once proud and jeweled, were reduced to suspicion and thin alliances. They shifted loyalties like coats in winter, for there was no true warmth in any camp now. Only the illusion of safety. Trust had gone out of fashion. Even faith, once the breath behind every oath, now flickered like the last stars before morning. England was exhausted. The land itself seemed to sag beneath the weight of it all. Villages burned and rebuilt, then burned again. Fields were left fallow, their seeds drowned in blood or silence. Sons never returned. Fathers stood in doorways longer than necessary, looking down roads that never answered them back. The great cathedrals still stood, but their bells rang more often for mourning than for marriage. Stone saints gazed down upon a people who had grown used to loss. And yet, strangely, the war had grown less visible. There were still battles, yes, but smaller, quicker. Not grand clashes with kings at the helm, but local feuds turned lethal. Retinues turning against neighbors. Power seized not on fields of glory, but in midnight raids and backroom whispers. It was a war of attrition now, not of territory, but of spirit. Even the nobles no longer knew whom they fought for. The white rose, the red. They had blurred, smeared into a bruise across the parchment of England. And into this long descent came the wanderers. Mercenaries who had changed sides too many times to remember their cause. Children who had never known peace, whose play mirrored the violence of their fathers. Clerics who questioned heaven. Mothers who hardened into granite. Poets who stopped writing. The war had become a fog. Not dense, not suffocating, but endless. A mist that clung to every bone, made every day feel the same. The kind of war that made you forget it had ever been different. Some still held hope, thin, threadbare hope, that it would end. But the ending, too, became a kind of ghost. Something seen just over the hill, always retreating. Richard III ruled now, his back bent by suspicion, his crown heavy with accusation. He was no stranger to dissent. He had seen too many graves dug for York princes, too many shadows stretched from his own deeds. He ruled not with glory, but with tension, like a rope drawn taut between storm and silence. Even his court felt like a play without applause. Titles and pageantry cloaking a kingdom slowly forgetting how to celebrate. The descent touched everyone, not just the courtly or the powerful, but the cobbler, the washerwoman, the monk. It was a national dream turned restless, a sleepwalk through ruins, and yet, within that weariness, something stirred, because weariness is not death. A nation that wanders is still breathing. Even in the descent, there is the soft possibility of a turning, the way a long winter finally exhales and makes room for thaw. Perhaps that is the secret of history, not that it falls, but that it falters. And in that faltering, in that slow, uncertain wandering, comes a chance to choose again, to see clearer, to remember. Let this chapter settle into your chest like dusk. Let the fog of England's weariness roll gently across your own heart. And know that even now, in the dimmest hour of the war, a dawn waits beyond the hill. Unseen, but real. They were last seen playing. Two boys, one 12, the other 9, inside the thick, cold walls of the Tower of London. Summer had begun to melt the city into gold, and yet within those stone corridors, time did not move. Edward, Prince of Wales. Richard, Duke of York. Sons of a dead king, heirs to a shattered throne. And then they were gone. No body, no trial, no farewell, just the gradual silence that creeps in when something precious is lost and no one dares say how. The tower, they say, remembers. Its walls, older than memory, have held kings and traitors, queens and ghosts, but few stories cling to its bones like the tale of the vanished princes. Some say Richard III had them killed, to secure his crown, to prevent rebellion, to quiet the Lancastrian murmur still echoing through England's uneasy halls. Others believe they died of illness, or were spirited away in the night by loyalists, rebels, or fate herself. Rumors bloomed like wildflowers in the fields of uncertainty. That one boy lived on, hidden under a false name, that a baker's son in Flanders carried royal blood, that the tower swallowed them whole and sang them to sleep forever. But the truth, like the boy's, was never found. And in that absence, myth began to grow. For there is something in the human soul that cannot tolerate silence around innocence, especially royal innocence, especially when 2 crowns were promised and none delivered. The people whispered. Even those who hated kings paused at the thought of 2 children locked away, not by barbarians, but by their own blood. No painter could capture their fate. No document confirmed it. Only absence spoke, louder than screams. The years passed, but the shadows lengthened. Even under Henry VII, long after Richard III lay dead at Bosworth, the story remained like a wound that wouldn't close. He built his Tudor dynasty on the ashes of both roses. He wed Elizabeth of York, sister to the missing princes. And still he feared their return, or someone claiming to be them, and so came the pretenders. Lambert Simnel, Perkin Warbeck, boys and men who claimed to be the lost heirs. Each time England trembled, not because it believed, but because it remembered. Because hope, even when false, carries weight. Because ghosts do not rest when the earth has no answer for their bones. The tower stood still through it all. Its walls watched generations pass, but never spoke. And beneath the White Tower, in 1674, nearly 2 centuries later, 2 small skeletons were found, buried under a staircase. No names carved, no ceremony given, just the shape of a tragedy left to history's mercy. Were they the princes? Perhaps. But even the bones whispered only in riddles. To this day, the tower is colder in those halls. The shadows linger longer near the stairwells. Visitors speak of unease, of strange whispers, of laughter where none should be. Because they were not merely boys. They were England's memory, wrapped in velvet and betrayal. Their vanishing wasn't just the death of 2 heirs. It was the end of childhood in the story of the roses, an innocence crushed by ambition, a silence louder than war. Yet from that silence comes a lesson. That power without mercy becomes haunted. That truth, when buried, grows into myth, and myth never truly dies. And that history, no matter how carefully written, will always carry questions where its pages tear. So tonight, let your breath slow as the Thames did on that summer evening. Picture the tower not as a place of fear, but as a cradle of forgotten voices. Stone warmed by sun. A chamber where 2 young brothers once dreamed of coronets and tournaments, unaware of the storm that would steal their names. And as you drift into sleep, remember this. The world does not forget its lost children. It sings for them, it weeps for them, and in quiet corners of old towers and older hearts, it still waits for their return. It was a kingdom balanced on suspicion. By the summer of 1485, the roses had shed most of their petals. What bloomed now was mistrust, delicate and poisonous, wearing velvet robes and carrying polished daggers beneath embroidered sleeves. Richard III wore the crown, but it fit uneasily, not for lack of blood. He was York through and through. But the realm had grown tired of kings who bled their brothers to keep their thrones. And across the sea, In exile, a quiet wind stirred. Henry Tudor, a name once forgotten, barely whispered in the back rooms of Lancastrian memory, now risen like a tide over still water. His claim was thin, almost threadbare, woven through a line of illegitimacy and hope. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he wasn't Richard. What mattered was that he might be something new. England, exhausted, looked to him not with certainty, but with yearning. And in the candlelit halls of power, the velvet betrayals began. Not loud, not sudden, but soft, deliberate. Like a chess piece moved by fingertips in the dark. Men who had sworn oaths to Richard began to send letters to Brittany. Words folded in silk, sealed in wax, delivered by candlelight. They wrote of supply routes, of troop movements, of weaknesses in the king's armor. Some did it out of ambition, others from fear. Most did it simply because the war had stripped them of belief in permanence. In this war, crowns changed like seasons, better to guess the next spring before the frost set in. Among them was Lord Stanley, a man with power, wealth, and, most dangerously, a foot in both camps. He was married to Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, yet he served Richard, swore loyalty before God and sword alike. He was the war-made flesh, uncertain, calculating, waiting for the right wind to change. Richard knew this, and it ate at him, not in fury, but in that cold, sleepless vigilance that turns kings into shadows of themselves. So when Henry Tudor set sail from France with no great army, only a few thousand men and the weight of English discontent, Richard did not laugh. He prepared, and he watched the velvet. He sent orders, tightened alliances, but even then, the betrayals moved faster than his messengers, because by now the war was no longer about houses, it was about endings. The nobles had tired of intrigue, the people had tired of blood, the land had tired of itself. And in the quiet corners of the realm, the idea of Henry Tudor became more than a man. He became a possibility. Perhaps. Richard rode north to gather support, but the north no longer rushed to meet him, and Henry landed, in Wales, almost unopposed. Each step he took toward the heart of England seemed to pull whispers behind him. Men joined him not out of loyalty, but fatigue. Not for the Lancastrian red, but for the dream of silence. Every mile closer to Bosworth was a mile deeper into betrayal. Richard's final days were spent tightening fists around Ayr. He called his men to battle. They came, but slowly. He summoned his banners. They flew, but without joy, and Lord Stanley, the spider at the center of every thread, remained still. He arrived near Bosworth with a large force and refused to pick a side. Richard sent his son as a hostage. Stanley sent no promise. The night before the battle, England did not sleep. Even the trees seemed to hold breath. It would be one final clash. Not the largest, not the most glorious, but it would decide everything. And velvet, that soft and noble fabric, had by then soaked up more blood than iron ever could. Betrayals, whispered in parlors, now stood fully armed on the field. As dawn broke over Bosworth, Richard stood tall, king still and proud. He would not flee. He would not cower. He had killed to earn his crown, and he would die wearing it if he must. And Henry, untested in battle, foreign in accent, uncertain in legacy, rode forward into history, not as a warrior, but as a wager. That England could end the war by choosing someone who had not yet ruled, not yet betrayed, not yet failed. A final gamble, a final silence before the charge, and Lord Stanley, oh Stanley, waited still. Let your eyelids grow heavy now, as England once did, beneath the weight of too many choices, too many shifting loyalties. Hear the hush before the trumpets, the quiet heartbeat of a nation choosing, once again, between blood and hope, between history and the chance to forget. For in the next breath, the roses will clash one final time, and the crown will fall into hands no one expected. It began in mist, August 22nd, 1485. The fields of Bosworth lay quiet, hushed as though nature itself held vigil. The air was thick with morning dew, and the sun broke slowly, reluctantly, through the folds of English sky. There was no fanfare, no prophecy, just the sound of hooves pressing into damp earth, and the breath of two men who carried the weight of centuries on their shoulders. Richard III stood with pride still sharp in his bones. He wore a circlet on his helm, a golden crown glinting over steel, as if to say, "This is mine, and I will not die without it." Before him, Henry Tudor, no crown, no royal bearing, only quiet resolve. He had never led an army before, never tested blade in the fire of English war. Yet behind him walked not just soldiers, but yearning. This was not a clash of equals. This was a reckoning. Richard had numbers, position, experience. But the air was different now. Treachery hovered like fog, and the banners that flew for York did so with less conviction than before. The battle began without poetry. Just the thud of boots and the low cry of men who had seen too many fields stained by the same civil war. Steel rang, arrows whispered. The grass was trampled by kings and commoners alike, and somewhere in the din, the last echoes of chivalry died. Richard fought as no king since antiquity. He did not hide behind generals. He saw Henry across the field, unguarded, young, vulnerable, and chose, in a single flash of will, to ride straight through the chaos and strike down the rebellion at its heart. He charged with fury, with courage, with something like despair. It is said he cried, "Treason! Treason!" For his flank had begun to crumble. The men he counted as allies, those whose oaths had been kissed in cathedral halls, had now turned from him. Northumberland withheld his troops. Stanley, oh Stanley, sir, still waited, still measured the winds. Richard rode on anyway. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer with his own hand. He came within reach of the crownless usurper, and then it ended. He was unhorsed, surrounded, struck from every side, alone, no retreat, no surrender. Richard, last king of the House of York, last of the Plantagenet line, died in the mud, crown torn from helm, body pierced, honor clinging to him like the blood in his armor. He died not as a tyrant, but as a man who dared the impossible charge. And when the field grew still and silence returned to Bosworth, the crown, golden, bent, smeared with earth, was found among the grass. It had fallen not on a throne, but into dirt. It was Lord Stanley who picked it up, the same Stanley who had waited, who had chosen silence until the last hour. He did not place it on his own head. He turned to Henry, and, before soldiers who barely knew for whom they had bled, crowned him king. Thus, with the lifting of a battered circlet, the Wars of the Roses ended, not with a flourish, but with mud, betrayal, and a battered piece of gold raised toward a future still unknown. Henry VII, first of the Tudors, stood amid the ruin. He had won not by might, but by surviving, by being the last gamble in a long and weary game. The bodies were gathered. Richard's corpse, naked and thrown over a horse, was buried with little ceremony in a Franciscan friary, later lost to time. The man who had once ridden like a lion fell into legend not as hero or villain, but as question. Was he the usurper or the rightful king, the murderer or the betrayed? And Bosworth, green, silent, eternal, remembered none of it. Only the footprints, the crushed blades of grass, the crown kissed by rain. As you breathe slowly now, sinking into the hush of sleep, remember that even kings fall. Even battles fought with fury end in whispers. Bosworth was not just a battlefield. It was a grave for a dynasty, a womb for a new one. a place where power changed hands not by divine right, but by chance, betrayal, and the quiet exhaustion of a people who simply wanted the fighting to end. And so they did. The roses, red and white, were gathered under one banner, one marriage, one house. But the thorns were still there, beneath the velvet, for no crown cleansed by blood ever forgets its past. From the ashes of battle, a fragile peace was born. The war that had cleaved England like a blade now bent toward union, a weaving of two roses, red and white, into a single stem. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, understood that his crown was not merely metal and jewels, but a symbol of fragile hope. His victory at Bosworth was a beginning, not an end. To cement this new era, he sought a union, not of armies, but of blood. Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, sister to the vanished princes, the very embodiment of the House of York. Their marriage was more than a wedding. It was a quiet declaration to a weary land that the cycle of roses, once bitterly torn, might be healed. The ceremony was modest, held in Westminster Abbey, but its meaning was immense. Two families, once locked in deadly rivalry, now joined beneath the same roof. The white rose of York entwined with the red rose of Lancaster, symbolizing hope that the thorny past might give way to blossoms. But this was no simple fairy tale. Beneath the smiles and celebrations lay shadows. The wounds of decades had not yet healed. Old loyalties lurked like ghosts in the halls, and Henry, ever cautious, understood that his claim was still delicate, his throne still vulnerable to those who remembered the lost princes, the betrayals, and the bloodshed. The marriage was a balm, but not a cure. It was a promise whispered across the land, a prayer that love might conquer history's deepest divides. The couple ruled with a measured hand. Their reign was slow to stabilize the realm. Henry avoided unnecessary conflict, weaving alliances with care. He restored courts, fostered trade, and sought to repair the fractured country. Elizabeth, queen in grace and resilience, bore children who would become the hope for the future. But the past was never far behind. Rebellions flickered like dying embers. Pretenders rose, claiming lost bloodlines, and the scars of war lingered in broken families, empty castles, and the memories of the people. Yet through it all, the red and white rose endured, the symbol of a kingdom trying to heal itself, a reminder that even in the darkest soil, new life can grow. As your eyelids grow heavy, picture the quiet halls of the Tudor court, tapestries woven with both roses, candles flickering in gentle breezes, the soft murmur of prayers for peace. Remember that history is not just about crowns and battles, but about the fragile hope that follows. And in that hope, there is rest. A new dawn rose over England, delicate as the petals of the Tudor rose itself. The wars had faded into memory, yet their shadows stretched long across the land. Henry VII's reign marked a turning point, a fragile beginning where the bruised earth could breathe again. The Tudor rose, the emblem of unity, blossomed as a symbol not only of peace, but of power tempered by wisdom. Yet beneath its beauty lay reminders of a past unwilling to be forgotten. The king moved cautiously. He knew that kingdoms are not built on peace alone, but on the fragile balance of loyalty and fear. Rebellion still flickered in distant corners. Pretenders, like ghosts from a forgotten chapter, rose to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Among them was Lambert Simnel, a boy presented as the Earl of Warwick, a Yorkist heir in disguise. The court watched with wary eyes as this shadow of conflict stirred. Henry's forces met the challenge, quashing the rebellion with both strategy and mercy. It was a message to those who whispered treason in the shadows. The new order would not be so easily undone. At court, Elizabeth of York remained a steady light. Her presence softened the sharp edges of power, a reminder that bloodlines were no longer meant to cleave but to connect. Together, the royal couple sought to bind the fractured nation through marriage, ceremony, and law. Trade flourished, art and culture found new patrons. England's gaze turned outward, toward new horizons, but the Tudor rose was not free from thorns. The memories of princes in the Tower lingered, lost children whose fate whispered doubt and sorrow in the corridors of power. Richard III's name became legend, both vilified and mourned, a symbol of how history can twist, bend, and burn. The people, weary from decades of war, longed for certainty, and yet certainty remained elusive. Kings and queens could hold crowns, but they could not hold time. The legacy of the Wars of the Roses was not just in battles won or lost, but in the souls shaped by them. The delicate balance of love and violence, loyalty and betrayal, memory and forgetting. As you drift deeper now, imagine the Tudor rose glowing softly in candlelight, a symbol both fragile and enduring. Know that history, like sleep, carries shadows and light intertwined. And in that gentle twilight, all things find their place. They were once boys. Laughter echoed through the halls of the tower, fleeting as candlelight on stone. The younger clutched a wooden sword. The elder, more solemn, watched the Thames roll by from his window. Princes, yes, but also brothers, sons, children of a crumbling dynasty, Edward and Richard. One crowned king, if only briefly. The other, his shadow, smaller in stature, but not in legacy. When Edward IV died, the world shifted beneath their feet. The Tower of London, once a place of security, became their last horizon. History does not speak in clear voices. It murmurs, it leaves trails, not truths. And so the fate of the princes in the Tower, like so much of the War of Roses, dissolves into shadow. Richard III took the throne. Some say he acted to protect the realm from chaos. Others, that ambition hardened his heart. The boys vanished. The chambers grew quiet. Their nurses, their tutors, their guards, replaced, silenced, or dismissed. What happened in that grey stone fortress? No cry rang out, no grave was marked, just the slow and terrible silence of two lives unaccounted for. Years passed, and their names became myths. In taverns, rumors grew like ivy. Some claimed the boys had been smuggled away, that one lived in secrecy abroad, that their ghosts walked the halls where they last played. Others spoke darker truths, of smothered pillows and loyal assassins, and still, no proof. Even the bones, when found centuries later beneath a stairwell, gave no certain answer. Were they the boys, or just two more among countless children lost to England's brutal tides? Richard III's name grew, heavy with suspicion. His reputation bent beneath the weight of the Tower's silence. But guilt in history is rarely clean. It may not have been Richard, it may have been fear, or politics, or others who saw opportunity in the dark. Whoever sealed their fate, the effect was eternal. They became symbols, not merely of murder, but of uncertainty. The War of Roses had taken many things: fathers, sons, kings, queens. But in the princes, it took innocence itself, and England never quite forgave itself. Even under Tudor rule, their shadows lingered. Pretenders rose, claiming to be Richard, the younger prince. Whether they believed their claims or wore them like armor matters little. The people, hungry for hope, listened. In every rebellion, in every whispered story, the boys returned. Not as ghosts, but as questions. What is a kingdom if it forgets its children? What is victory if purchased with silence? And what is memory when wrapped in legend? As the Tudor rose bloomed, the Tower remained, ancient, unmoved, a keeper of secrets. Tourists walked its grounds. Guards changed, monarchs came and went, but behind its stones, time hummed softly. And the names of Edward and Richard echoed still. Let them be remembered, not only as heirs to a throne, but as lost songs in a kingdom's long story. For in every war, there are those whose stories are never written in full, whose endings are left to mist and moonlight. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the two boys walking once more beside the river, the wind in their hair, the stars above London blinking like distant candles. No fear, no throne, just brothers, and silence made holy. After decades of war, England had placed its hope not in the strength of armies, but in the quiet breath of a child. Arthur. Born to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, Arthur Tudor was more than a prince. He was a symbol, the living union of Lancaster and York, the dream of peace bound into flesh and blood. The red and white roses had at last become one, and from that union came the boy who would be king. His name echoed myth. Arthur, like the once and future king of legend, a name drawn from misty tales of Camelot, knights, and a realm united by justice. In the naming of the child, there was both nostalgia and prophecy. And for a time it seemed the prophecy would hold. He was born in Winchester, long believed to be the seat of ancient Camelot, under stars that promised renewal. The court rejoiced. The people wept with hope. Here, finally, was the end of civil strife. A golden age whispered at the edges of the wind. Arthur was raised in care and ceremony. His education was shaped by scholars, his upbringing wrapped in the careful rituals of power. He was taught Latin, law, music, diplomacy. He read of kings and kingdoms, of faith and empire. And always, he was reminded, the peace of England slept in his bones. At age 15, he married Catherine of Aragon, a daughter of Spain whose bloodline was royal and whose dowry came wrapped in politics. The union was another symbol, another thread in the tapestry of Europe's shifting loyalties. Their wedding was magnificent, a feast of light and color, of gold-threaded gowns and flickering candles. The court danced, the choir sang, and England, still aching from memory, allowed itself to dream once more. But dreams, like spring blossoms, can wither under frost. Within months of their wedding, Arthur was sent with Catherine to Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches, a prince acting as king-in-waiting, learning to govern the edges of the realm. And then the illness came. No one knows its name now. Some said it was the sweating sickness, that old phantom of Tudor England. Others called it consumption, or merely the will of God. Whatever its name, it struck like lightning. First fever, then weakness, then stillness. Arthur died in April, in the year 1502. He was 15, and with his final breath, the kingdom's future unraveled again. The court fell silent. Elizabeth, his mother, wept alone behind curtains. Henry VII withdrew into caution and calculation, and Catherine, young, widowed, still barely a stranger to English soil, found herself wrapped not in royal joy, but in uncertainty. Arthur had been everything, a new beginning, a symbol of harmony. And now he was gone. The old pain returned. The ghost of civil war seemed to stir again beneath the throne. But there was another son. Henry, younger, spirited, second in line. In time he would wear the crown. In time he would marry Catherine himself. And in time his choices would rip the kingdom in two once more. But on this night, let us linger with Arthur. Let us pause in that quiet chamber in Ludlow, where a crown was lost before it was ever worn. Let us remember the soft fall of snow outside stone walls, the silence of a world that dared to hope, and the hush that follows when destiny changes its course. For in the history of kings, it is not only those who ruled who shaped the land, but also those who never did. Arthur remains a whisper in England's long tale, a boy born of peace, a promise made and broken in the same breath. And though he left no throne, his shadow shaped the fate of all who came after. As your breath slows, picture the young prince by a window, parchment in his hand, a map of his father's kingdom laid before him, his thoughts adrift between legend and law. He did not live to wear the crown, but he lived long enough to carry its weight, and in that quiet bearing, he became timeless. Where Arthur faded, Henry thundered. He was not meant to rule, not first, not at all. But the crown found him, gleaming and weighty, and he wore it like a birthright. Second son, suddenly heir, Henry VIII inherited not just a throne, but the collective breath of a kingdom still raw from memory. Gone were the battlefields of Towton and Bosworth, yet the echoes of war clung to the royal walls. The War of the Roses was no longer fought with swords. It lingered in bloodlines, in questions of legitimacy, in the fragile balancing act of dynasty. Henry came of age in that tension, and rather than retreat, he stepped forward with a stride that would fracture empires and unmake saints. He was tall, golden, educated, and adored. He was also restless. Crowned at 17, he married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, claiming continuity and perhaps redemption. The people rejoiced. The Tudor rose bloomed brighter under his early reign, kissed by promises of order, strength, and renewal. But the shadow of succession never left. Catherine bore him a daughter, Mary, intelligent, devout, but no son, no prince to guard the legacy, no heir to silence old Yorkist claims, no assurance that civil war would not rise again like a forgotten flame. And so Henry turned, first to prayer, then to Parliament, then to defiance. He looked to Rome, then away from it. And with that gaze, kingdoms shifted. What began as a marriage question, the desire to annul his bond with Catherine and wed Anne Boleyn, became a spiritual revolt. Henry broke with the Pope, declared himself head of the Church in England, confiscated monasteries, dissolved centuries of tradition, stripped altars bare, and England watched, stunned and divided, as a king became both monarch and priest. He did it, he claimed, for the future, for the boy he had not yet fathered, for the crown that would not rest easy on the head of a girl. Anne Boleyn bore him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son lived long enough to ease his doubt. And so, the cycle continued. Marriage, divorce, execution, death, 6 queens, 1 male heir, a trail of broken vows and silent prayers left in the wake of a king who would not be denied. Henry VIII ruled not with the silence of Arthur, nor the subtlety of Henry VII. He ruled with thunder. He dissolved the sacred. He bled the monasteries. He watched friends rise as favorites and fall as traitors. Thomas More, once his confidant, was sent to the scaffold. So too was Anne Boleyn, queen turned ghost. Even his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, was unmade with a signature. And in the end, even triumph looked like defeat. His son, Edward, frail and fleeting, his kingdom divided along lines of doctrine and doubt. The Tudor rose, once planted to promise peace, now bloomed among ruins. Yet Henry endured, larger than life, wounded, limping, aging, yet unyielding. He built ships, fortresses, courts of spectacle and shadow. He feared rebellion, yet inspired loyalty. He broke the church, yet strengthened the monarchy. He is remembered in contradictions, tyrant and visionary, monster and founder. And perhaps that is fitting, for the legacy of the Wars of the Roses was never clear. It lived not only in peace, but in paranoia, not only in hope, but in obsession. Henry VIII was the last great echo of that war. Not in bloodshed, but in the relentless need to secure a dynasty at any cost. And as you drift now into sleep, imagine the king alone in his palace, surrounded by portraits of wives and children, saints and symbols, haunted not by ghosts, but by uncertainty. He changed everything, and yet could not change time. The Tudors would not last forever, but for one long reign they stood like a flame in the dark, bold, beautiful, and burning through history's quiet mist. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind more than a throne. He left 3 children, each bearing a different mother, each carved from different shadows, each carrying a fragment of England's soul. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. 3 names whispered like a prayer across a kingdom still trembling beneath the weight of broken altars and beheaded queens. 3 heirs, each crowned in turn, each tasked with answering the same question: what in the end shall this country be? Edward VI, the boy king. He was just 9 years old when the crown was placed upon his head, a solemn boy with sharp eyes and a body too thin for the robes he wore. Edward, the son of Jane Seymour, the only male heir Henry had longed for. He was a Protestant by birth, shaped by reformers, tutored in Greek and Latin, brought up to believe that faith must be stripped of ornament and kings must lead both altar and realm. And for a time, the kingdom followed him. Under Edward, the Reformation deepened. Priests were unvested, masses were silenced, Latin was banished. The Book of Common Prayer, in English tongue, became the heartbeat of a changing church. But he was sickly. Consumption, cough, pallor. The court prayed in silence as he withered before their eyes, and by age 15, he was gone. A boy who ruled in name but left behind a fire still smouldering in the halls of Parliament and the cathedrals of England. Tafifues, the Queen of Ashes. Then came Mary, Henry's eldest daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She had known exile in her own court, branded illegitimate when her mother fell from favor, cast aside by the father who once adored her. Yet when Edward died, she marched to London with banners aloft and the cries of the people behind her. Queen at last, Catholic, devout, determined. She sought not vengeance, she said, but restoration. The old faith returned, the heresy burned out, the country's soul made whole again. And so the fires began. Protestant martyrs lit the sky with smoke. 280 souls burned under her reign. Bishops, bakers, scholars, teenagers. It earned her a name she would never shed, Bloody Mary. She married Philip of Spain, hoped for a child, felt the swelling of her belly. But it was no heir, only a phantom, a womb filled with longing and nothing more. She died in sorrow, without child, without joy, without legacy, but even in her failure, she passed the crown to a woman who would make England myth again. Elizabeth IV, the Virgin Queen, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, once declared illegitimate, now crowned with silent breath and skeptical hearts. But Elizabeth rose, not with force, but with flame. She was cunning, poised, patient. She ruled not as her father had, with hunger and thunder, but with theatre and intelligence. She wrapped herself in symbols. Gloriana, Astrea, the fairy queen. Virgin, they called her, married not to man, but to England itself. She was Protestant, but not radical. She was royal, but walked among her people. She was woman, but wore power like a second skin. The kingdom flourished. Explorers sailed west beneath her flag. Poets sang her praises. Spies whispered her name in Catholic courts. She outlived rebellions, assassins, and the Armada of Spain. And though she ruled alone, she ruled with majesty. No child would follow her, but she needed none. Her reign became its own legend. The end of the Tudors. With Elizabeth's death in 1603, the Tudor line ended. Not with violence, but with silence. She had ruled for 45 years, and in that time she had made a fractured kingdom into a stage for glory. The War of the Roses, once fought for sons and lineage, faded into memory beneath her golden gaze. But its ghost lingered, in the hunger for heirs, in the terror of division, in the crown itself, heavy, trembling, ever uncertain. Now let your eyes close. Picture the halls of Whitehall, where the last Tudor breathed her final breath. The candle smoke curled, the velvet curtains stirred, and somewhere in the stone, the echoes of Lancaster and York stilled at last. The children of Henry had come and gone, and with them a chapter closed. But in the silence that followed, a new age waited, not born from war, but from words. For from the ashes of roses, the age of Shakespeare had bloomed. The roses had faded, their petals folded into legend, but the soil of England was still restless. When Elizabeth died childless in 1603, the crown passed not to a Tudor, but to a Stewart, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, great-grandson of Margaret Tudor. A thread of York and Lancaster, twisted northward, wound back down. A king from beyond the border now ruled both thistle and rose, and with him came unity, or so it seemed. A union of crowns, not hearts. James was clever, devout, and fond of words. He wrote on kingship, witchcraft, the divine right of rulers. He saw himself as both shepherd and sovereign, placed by God, answerable only to heaven. He dreamed of a unified Britain, England and Scotland under one banner, one Bible, one throne. But old wounds were not so easily healed. The people muttered. The court watched. He was not Elizabeth. He was foreign, Scottish, reserved, and too fond of absolutism. Still, he ruled with relative calm. Under James, the King James Bible was born. Not merely a translation, but a monument of language, a crown made of scripture. Under James, peace held. No civil wars, no burning heretics, a quieter time. But even silence can tremble, and in the shadows, the fuse was already lit. Gunpowder and ghosts. In 1605, a plot was uncovered beneath Parliament itself, barrels of gunpowder stacked in the cellar, ready to explode. Catholic rebels, desperate to end persecution and crown a monarch of their faith, had conspired to blow the Protestant monarchy skyward. Guy Fawkes was caught, tortured, and executed. And though the plot failed, it left its mark. Suspicion, division, and the scent of gunpowder forever etched into England's breath. Charles I, the king who would not bend. When James died in 1625, his son Charles inherited more than a crown. He inherited the gathering storm. Where James was careful, Charles was rigid. Where his father negotiated, Charles commanded. He believed in kingship not as a burden, but as divine truth. He married a Catholic queen, dissolved Parliament, raised taxes without consent, and in doing so awakened a fury that had long slumbered beneath England's new peace. The people stirred. The Puritans preached. The Commons rebelled. And slowly, brick by brick, England built its own reckoning. The English Civil War, it began like all wars do, with words, then refusals, then arms. The country split. Royalists, Cavaliers, loyal to the king, the crown, the old ways. Parliamentarians, Roundheads, loyal to law, liberty, and a vision of rule shared, not seized. From 1642 to 1651, England tore itself apart. Fathers fought sons. Villages split, churches bled, cities burned. Not since the Wars of the Roses had the nation been so stained by its own reflection. And just like then, it ended with silence, a king on his knees. Charles was captured, tried by his own subjects, and in 1649, beheaded. A sovereign struck down by the hand of law. The roses wept in their graves. The Republic and the Lord Protector. What followed was not peace, but experiment. England became a republic. The monarchy dissolved, the House of Lords abolished, the church stripped of bishops. Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan general, rose as Lord Protector, a title that sounded modest but masked a reign of iron. He ruled like a king without the name. Closed the theatres, banned the feast days, crushed rebellion in Ireland with fire and steel. He said it was for God. But God, perhaps, was silent. When Cromwell died, so too did the Republic's breath. England, tired of austerity and grey, looked once more to the bloodline it had severed. The Restoration. A crown returned. In 1660, Charles II, son of the executed king, returned from exile. The monarchy was restored. So was laughter. The theatres opened, the bells rang. London danced, but something had changed. The king no longer ruled as before. Parliament had power now, not as ornament, but as partner. The divine right had cracked, and so, slowly, the kingdom stepped into a new age, no longer a land of roses and thorns, but of contracts and questions. No longer a throne unchallenged, but one watched by the eyes of the people. What the Stuarts carried the Stuart line was not the end of the story, but it was the final echo of something begun centuries before, when York met Lancaster in fields of fog and blood. The Tudors had claimed to end the Wars of the Roses. The Stuarts revealed its ghost never truly faded, because the real war was not merely for a crown, it was for the soul of England, for how a land should be ruled, by whom, for whom, and why. Let your breath soften. The fields lie quiet now. The sword rests in its scabbard. The chapel bells toll only for time itself. The roses still bloom, not in anger, but in memory. And through the Stuarts we remember that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the tending of the roots beneath it. A monarchy born in war had walked through fire once more, and what emerged was something new. Not a kingdom of saints or kings, but of questions, and of the people bold enough to ask them. It came not with swords, but with sails, not with fire, but with parchment and oath, not with roses torn from the earth, but with a single, silent step across the channel. The year was 1688, and England, still haunted by the question of kingship, would answer it not with battle, but with a revolution of restraint, one they would call glorious. But glory, like peace, wears many faces, and revolutions, even the quiet ones, are born from deep unrest. James II, the unwelcome return. Charles II had died in 1685, charming to the last, leaving no heir but a nation relieved by his laughter. His brother James now stood upon the throne, and with him the past returned. James II was Catholic, openly, proudly. He worshipped in Latin, kept priests close, and believed, as kings once had, that his power was not Parliament's to question. But England had changed. Since Cromwell, since Charles, since the long scars of civil war, the people had come to see monarchy not as mandate but trust, not as divine right but mutual agreement. And James, with every decree, broke that trust. He placed Catholics in high command, suspended laws by edict, dissolved Parliament. He had a son, a male heir, raised Catholic, and with him the spectre of a Catholic dynasty rose again. Whispers turned to protests, protests to panic, and soon nobles sent letters, not within the kingdom, but across the sea. William and Mary, the invitation. In the cold halls of The Hague, William of Orange read the invitation. He was Dutch, Protestant, husband to Mary, daughter of James II. He was no invader by conquest. He was summoned, they said, to save the English constitution, to restore the Protestant line, to defend liberty. And so he came, with ships, with troops, with the wind behind him. But there was no blood. James, abandoned by his army, his allies, even his daughter, fled into exile, the last Stewart monarch to believe the crown was untouchable. The throne did not follow him. A crown offered, not claimed. In 1689, Parliament extended the crown to William and Mary, not by inheritance, but by invitation. It was a radical act, wrapped in calm ritual. For the first time, the English crown was offered conditionally, and with it came a document more powerful than any sword, the Bill of Rights. It stated, plainly, irrevocably, that the king may not suspend laws at will, no taxation without Parliament's consent, no standing army in peacetime, no cruel and unusual punishments, no monarch may override the law, and perhaps most importantly, that Parliament, not the crown, is sovereign. The divine right of kings, that old, dangerous dream, breathed its last in that parchment. A bloodless revolution? They called it glorious, because there was no civil war, because no king's head fell, because liberty, it seemed, had been restored without blood. But history is never so simple. In Ireland and Scotland, battles still raged. James tried to reclaim his throne. Catholic hopes flickered and died at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. In the colonies, ripples were felt. Authority was questioned, governance renegotiated. And though England called it bloodless, not all lands would agree. But in the quiet heart of London, something had indeed shifted, not in war, but in thought. The rise of constitutional monarchy. From this moment forward, England would no longer be ruled by kings, but governed by law. Monarchs would reign, but not rule. Crown and Parliament would dance, but it would be Parliament that set the tune. In the aftermath, new systems rose. Regular parliaments, independent judiciary, press freedoms, the modern two-party system with Whigs and Tories dividing visions of the future. The monarchy had not ended, but it had been rewritten. From fire and axe and battlefield, it had become a symbol, no longer a sword, but a scepter held in ceremony. Reflections in rose-colored dust. And so we return, not to York or Lancaster, but to the deeper question beneath their war. What is power? Is it bloodline, sword, divine decree? Or is it something agreed upon, held in trust, broken by hubris, restored by consent? The Glorious Revolution did not answer these fully. No era ever does. But it bent the arc toward the idea that a ruler is made not by God's whisper alone, but by the people's voice. The War of the Roses had once torn a country apart in search of a rightful king. Now England sought not the right man, but the right system, and though the roses still bloomed in memory, they now bloomed beneath a crown that had learned to bow. Close your eyes. The parchment rustles. The candle flickers. The ink dries on history's turning page. Divine right is gone, but something gentler, if more complex, remains. A monarchy in balance, a kingdom that remembers. And somewhere in the garden of time, the ghosts of red and white roses turn their faces to the light. The war was over. The swords were sheathed. The banners lowered. But the War of the Roses did not end like a story neatly closed. No, it lingered, like a shadow beneath the soil, like the quiet pulse of an ancient river flowing unseen. Its legacy was not just in the stones of ruined castles, nor the graves of fallen kings, but in the very shape of England itself. The war had been a brutal contest of blood and power. But more than that, it was a mirror held to a fractured land. In the red, rose, and white, the struggle was not simply for throne or territory, but for identity. Who was England? What was its soul? Was it the pride of noble birth, the claim of lineage, or the strength of unity, of law, of common purpose? The war forced England to confront itself, to see its divisions, its wounds, its hopes. And in that reflection, something began to change. The war's end marked a new beginning. With Henry Tudor crowned Henry VII, a dynasty was born not of ancient, inflexible claims, but of cautious reconciliation. He married Elizabeth of York, binding the two roses in a fragile peace. The symbol itself a promise. No longer enemies, but entwined. This union would lay the foundation for a more centralized, more unified England. A kingdom slowly shedding the chaos of feudal wars and embracing the idea of nationhood. In those quiet years that followed, England grew. Cities expanded. Commerce flourished. Art and learning bloomed. And the court became a place not just of power, but of culture. But the roses left scars deeper than the eye could see. The war taught rulers that legitimacy was fragile, earned not just through birthright, but through trust, justice, and the consent of those they ruled. It taught the people the cost of division, how brother could turn on brother, how loyalty could twist into betrayal. It showed the fragility of peace, the danger of pride, the power of memory. Every crown that followed carried the weight of those lessons, a reminder that kings were not gods, but men bound to history's long chain. Stories grew around the war. Poems, ballads, legends whispered in the halls and fields where battles had raged. The roses became symbols, their colors bleeding into art, heraldry, and language. The war's brutality softened into myth, its players transformed into archetypes. The tragic king, the usurper, the loyal knight, the cunning queen. These stories shaped England's sense of self, a tale of conflict and reconciliation, of tragedy and triumph, of a nation forged in fire. Centuries later, when England looked back at its past, at the Wars of the Roses, it saw not just a war, but a mirror of human nature, a mirror of ambition, fear, loyalty, and love, a mirror of the eternal dance between power and conscience. And that mirror still reflects. Every time a kingdom questions who should rule, every time a people seek to balance strength with justice, the legacy of the roses whispers in the wind. So let us breathe in the silence left by the war, hear the echoes in ruined towers, the rustle of petals fallen long ago, feel the weight of history settling softly on the shoulders of the present. Know that the roses bloom not just in gardens, but in memory, a sacred, fragile bloom that reminds us all that even in war's darkest shadow, the human spirit seeks peace and identity is forged through the stories we choose to remember. The night grows deeper, the past whispers, and the roses, red and white, fold gently into sleep. The dawn breaks softly over England's rolling hills, casting long shadows from ancient oaks and stone keeps. The roses of war have wilted, yet their scent lingers still, a delicate fragrance woven through the tapestry of time. England returns, reborn, yet forever marked. The kingdom that once fractured by civil strife now breathes anew, carrying the weight of its past in one hand and the promise of its future in the other. The crown restored Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, stood at the crossroads of history, a king born of conflict but determined to heal its wounds. His marriage to Elizabeth of York was no mere alliance. It was a symbol, a binding of rival houses into a single thread of hope. With this union, the crown was restored, not just upon a head, but in the hearts of a divided people. Yet Henry's reign was cautious. He knew the power of fear and the cost of rebellion, so he built slowly, strengthening his throne by weaving law, order, and diplomacy instead of open war. A kingdom of laws, the chaos of feudal battles had left scars too deep to ignore. Henry VII understood that to secure peace, the kingdom must become more than the sum of its lords and knights. It must be a nation, held together not by the sword alone, but by the invisible chains of law and justice. Through the establishment of the Star Chamber, the king sought to curtail the overweening power of nobles to prevent them from turning their private armies against each other again. England began to shape a new order where allegiance was owed to the crown, but tempered by the rule of law. The seeds of constitutional monarchy had taken root, quiet and unseen, waiting to bloom. Light and shadow. But rebirth is never without shadows. The wounds of war lingered in the hearts of many. Old loyalties simmered beneath polite smiles, and whispers of Yorkist claimants stirred unease. The peace Henry forged was delicate, a fragile tapestry, woven with threads of hope and fear. The Tudors would face many storms ahead, religious upheavals, court intrigues, and the shifting tides of power. Yet from these challenges would emerge a new England, one that would look outward to the world and inward to its soul. The echo of the roses. The War of the Roses had ended, but its echo remained. It was heard in the halls of power, felt in the songs sung by village folk, and seen in the art and literature blossoming under the Tudor reign. The roses, red and white, became emblems of a nation's journey, reminding all who gazed upon them of the cost of division and the fragile beauty of unity. They whispered a lesson, timeless and true, that history is a path paved with both light and shadow, and that the soul of a nation is forged in the balance. Reflections at day's end. As twilight descends, we pause to reflect. The story of the War of the Roses is not just a tale of kings and battles. It is the story of humanity, of pride and fear, of love and betrayal, of destruction and renewal. England returned from the brink, scarred but wiser. Its identity shaped not just by bloodshed, but by the enduring hope for peace and justice. And as night falls softly, the roses fold in quiet repose, a final sigh in a story that continues to unfold, written in the hearts of all who call this land home. The past is a gentle flame, casting warm light and cool shadow. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let the story rest. For tomorrow, the roses bloom again. Beneath the quiet soil of England, where moss creeps over broken tombstones and the wind moves softly through yew and ivy, the legacy of the roses still blooms, unseen but not unfelt. The War of the Roses is over. Its kings have turned to dust, its banners now faded cloth in museums, its battlefields reclaimed by sheep and grass. But history, true history, is not buried. It lingers, it transforms, it becomes the very soil from which a people rise. From blood to nationhood, in the fragile silence that followed Bosworth Field, England did not simply heal, it evolved. No longer merely a chessboard of noble factions, it began to feel itself as a singular breath, a kingdom, a body, a people with memory and meaning. The war had been long and bitter. It had torn sons from mothers, brothers from brothers. It had leveled towns and cast doubt upon the very meaning of legitimacy. But in its ashes rose something new, a sense of shared past, a wound that, in being shared, became a kind of unity. No longer were kings chosen by divine whim alone. The people, those who tilled fields, rang church bells, wrote books, they began to watch, they began to remember. And in that memory, the seed of nationhood took root. The myth becomes memory. Time softened the edges of the conflict. The once burning names, Plantagenet, Neville, Beaufort, became echoes wrapped in parchment and poetry. Shakespeare would immortalize the wars, not as a brutal reckoning, but as a sweeping tragedy, a stage where human flaws wore crowns and fate wandered drunk through royal halls. Through art, the roses bloomed again. Through story, they were watered with new meaning. And so the War of the Roses entered not just the chronicles of kings, but the soul of English memory. A tale to be retold, reflected upon, and carried forward. Legacy in law and bloodline. The Tudors, born of both houses, became more than rulers. They were the bridge over the river of division. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. Their reigns bore the mark of that uneasy union, their policies shaped by the haunting lesson: never again let a crown fall to the chaos of ambition unchecked. Parliament grew more assertive. The divine right of kings was whispered, not shouted, and each monarch after the Roses knew the throne was a trust, not a birthright. Lessons in the dust. Even now, in the present world of cities and satellites, the War of the Roses holds its place in the mirror of time. Its story teaches us that power without wisdom breeds ruin, that vengeance dressed as justice leaves only silence, that unity, when forged in humility and memory, can outlast even the darkest centuries. The red rose and the white are not just flowers. They are questions. They ask us, what do you do with your victories? How do you remember your wounds? And what kind of world do you build after the war is done? Whispers beneath the soil. In Tewkesbury, in Towton, in the corners of old chapels and sunlit ruins, there are places where the earth remembers. Where ghosts do not haunt, they whisper. They whisper of men who believed they were heroes, of women who bore kingdoms in silence, of a nation that bled to find its name. And if you press your ear to the ground, you might still hear it. The thrum of hoofbeats, the rustle of cloaks in the dark, the soft weeping of England as she gathered her sons back into the earth. The bloom eternal. And so the war ends not with silence, but with song. The roses bloom still, not only in gardens and books, but in the consciousness of a people who carry them without even knowing. They bloom in justice wrested from tyranny. They bloom in art born from suffering. They bloom in memory, that sacred duty of the living, to carry the past gently, like a petal in one's palm. And as night settles over England, and the wind moves through its hedgerows and hills, the roses rest, not forgotten, not gone, simply folded into the soil of time. The story sleeps. The War of the Roses has told its tale. A tale of grief and glory, of madness and mercy, of what it means to fight for a crown, and what it costs to wear one. Let it rest now. Let the thorns soften. Let the soil hold the secrets. Close your eyes. The petals are falling. The story sleeps. And so may you.